All right, good to see everybody. Today we're going to pick up in our study in the Old Testament in Genesis chapter 2. In the first part of Genesis chapter 2. And as you might recall, we've been going through the creation story and just kind of making analogies between the creation and what we experience spiritually in new creation. We saw how God spoke into the darkness and said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And we took note of the fact that in our spiritual life, that's what happened to us as well. As we received revelation of the knowledge of the truth, a light shone in our hearts, and we were able to see the light of the knowledge of God in the face of Jesus, as 2 Corinthians chapter 4 talks about. And then we also saw how once you have that revelation, you then can discern some things. You can discern between what is light, what is darkness, what is of heaven, and what is of earth. And it leads also to resurrection. As the dry land appeared, rising up out of the waters, so we too in baptism go down into the waters, but then are raised to walk in newness of life. And then after that, we see that immediately on the same day, after resurrection, there was the vegetation and the fruit bearing. Seed bearing fruit after their kind, that sort of thing. And as soon as we are resurrected in Christ, we immediately are called to go out and bear fruit in whatever capacity we're able to at that point. And then we saw also after that point, we got into the church aspect of it, right? We saw how the earth wasn't just placed up in the cosmos all by itself, but it was placed within a community of terrestrial bodies. The sun and the moon and the stars, and all of those would accompany the earth, but also give benefit to the earth as it's in a community. And we saw that we as believers, we enter into this new life, not so that we could go off and do our own thing, but that we can get plugged into a community of believers that can help us and benefit us. So we saw that. We also saw that the birds in the sky, the fish in the sea, we saw the animals on the ground. All of those had gifts and talents based upon what it was that God wanted them to function as. The birds had the gift of flight. The fish had the gift of swimming. The beasts had the gift of traversing the earth and eating of the shrubs of the field and the grass. All the animals are diverse and are diverse because of the various gifts and abilities God had given them. The same thing is true with the church as well. Each of us have been given gifts and abilities and talents so that we can further build on the ecosystem, so to speak, of the church, so that it can flourish, so that life can flourish, so that fruit can be born, and all of those things. And we looked at all those in some detail over the past few weeks. But now we get in chapter 2 with really no activity. We see God actually resting here in chapter 2. Starting in verse 1, it says, "Thus the heavens and the earth were completed, and all their hosts. By the seventh day God completed his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made." Maybe this is the most mysterious part of the whole creation story. When we think about God and all of his power and his glory, we think about in everything that he's able to accomplish based on his strength and his might. We're real comfortable with seeing a God who's working. We're real comfortable with a God who speaks universes into existence, speaks moon and stars into existence. A God who's powerful, who's working, who's accomplishing things. But here on the seventh day, we see a God who's resting. A God who has ceased from his labors. A God who said, "You know what? Everything's accomplished and now I'll rest." And this is the mysterious part about creation. And we might wonder, why is this day there anyways, if nothing's happening? Why could he have not just created the earth, molded the earth in 6 days, and then immediately there's the first day of the week? It seems, just looking at it on the surface, it looks like an unnecessary day. Nothing's happening. God's not doing anything. Nothing productive seems to be happening. Why is the seventh day there? Well, that's kind of what we want to explore in our study today. probably the main thing that we find, and the most obvious thing that we find by observing this fact that God had rested on the seventh day, even created the seventh day and just rested there, was that he's showing us the importance of rest. God had, in his days of creation, basically entered into the human experience, especially under Jewish law, which, remember, Genesis, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, are believed to have been written by Moses at Sinai, probably maybe after the Ten Commandments had already been given. They already knew about the Sabbath. And the story of the creation was in a way showing that God had experienced exactly what the Jews were to experience in their day-to-day life. What is the 7 days of creation? It's a work week. That's basically what it is. You work 6 days. God worked on the first day, created light, second day, so on and so forth. He worked 6 days, and then he rested on the seventh day. This would have been very comfortable in the Jewish mind, because that's what their week looked like. They go out and work in the fields. Maybe they work their cattle. They're working their crops 6 days, but then they're told to rest on the seventh day. And so God is showing them and demonstrating by example, this is what your life should be like. It should be a experience in which you are both working, but at the same time resting, and having those two in balance. A lot of problems arise in our lives when we get out of balance. When we have too much work, when we're running ourselves ragged, when we're working 7 days a week, we don't rest, and we're always going 100 miles per hour, and we're running on adrenaline, and we get into the craziness of this society and stuff, and we try to fulfill all these expectations, and we never learn how to rest. That's not healthy for us. We need to learn how to put on the brakes and rest. Jesus did this even in his ministry, right? This is brought out probably more so in the book of Luke than the other Gospels, but it's brought out in pretty much all of them. Jesus would be working, the crowds would be pressing against him. He's trying to talk to them and minister to them and heal them. And what would he do? He would slip off to the wilderness to pray, or he'd go up on the mountain and pray. Jesus knew that rest was important. But sometimes we do the other extreme too. You can rest too much. And sometimes it's the fact that some people, that's all they want to do is rest, and they don't ever want to work. And of course, you can go to the book of Proverbs and talk about go to the ant, you sluggard, and we could go to these different passages that talk about it's important to work. And so life is really all about this balance between working and resting. And it's very important. So that's probably the most, practical or obvious lesson that we get in God intentionally having this seventh day of rest, teaching us humans, hey, take a break, rest. It's okay, relax. The world's not going to stop without you. It'll be okay. But this also shows that the God that we serve is a God of rest. It's an important truth about Jesus, and it kind of leads into really what our lesson is all about. By God starting things off by resting, basically, what he's showing us is a little bit of his nature, a little bit of what he's all about. Our God is a God of rest, and he's not just a God of rest in that he likes to rest, but he's a God of rest in that he likes to invite us into rest. Time and time again throughout scriptures, we find God bringing his people into rest. And rest becomes a great theme in the scriptures. We could look at Adam and Eve themselves. How did God create them? Did he place them in some factory and said, here, you got to work hard? Or did he put them out in some kind of rugged terrain where they're going to have to really work by the sweat of their brow and the blood of their knuckles? No, he put them in a garden. And that garden was a place of rest. It was a place in which everything was going to be fully supplied. Yes, they were to tend and keep the garden, but it was going to be a pleasant type of work. Kind of like you would do recreationally on the weekend, tending to your garden, trimming your trees. Just pleasant work that you don't really have to depend on and be worried about or anxious about because you're already fully supplied. They were just supposed to keep a watch on the garden. But primarily, they were just going to rest in the garden. So at the very beginning, he leads his people into rest. Of course, that goes awry. And then we get to Noah, the story of Noah. And some may not realize this, but the name Noah actually means rest. I remember his father called him Noah because he said, basically prophesied that he's going to lead us to rest. And absolutely so. God did bring the earth to rest through Noah. Before Noah came, before the flood came, the earth was laboring under the sin, the rebellion, the wickedness, the violence of humankind. There was no rest for the human soul because everywhere you turned there was evil and people killing one another and things like that. Well, when the flood came and God worked through Noah by bringing about this flood, it brought the earth back to a state of rest. And even Noah and his family found rest. No longer had to worry about people ridiculing them or making fun of them. They could just rest after the flood. And so God brought Noah and his family into rest through the flood. The Israelites, laboring hard under the Egyptians, hard bondage. Even their children were threatened. Their lives were threatened. And when Moses does make it down to help them, it gets even worse, right? They not only had to make bricks, but they had to go out and collect their own straw. Just laboring very hard. And God saw the labor that they were under, the bondage that they were under. And he told Moses there at the burning bush, he said, I'm going to come and I'm going to bring them out of bondage. And I'm going to bring them to a state of rest. It's paraphrasing, but it's basically what he did. He brought them out of Egypt, away from the place of bondage, to lead them into a place of rest. But then we could even go further and go into the New Testament. Isn't that what Jesus is all about? About rest. Giving people rest. And this is pictured even in the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. An interesting thing, if church tradition is correct, and if Jesus really was crucified on Friday, of course the scriptures doesn't say Friday, but people conclude that it was Friday because it says it was before the Sabbath. But nonetheless, if you go with church tradition, you say he was crucified on Friday, it's interesting, parallel comes up between creation and Jesus' own experience. On that Friday when Jesus was crucified, what did he say before he breathed his last breath? It is finished, right? There on the sixth day, on Friday, he would have said, it is finished. What does it say here in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 1? Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their hosts. Here on the sixth day, all of creation was completed and all the hosts were done. God could basically say, it is finished. On the Friday that Jesus was crucified, he too could say, it is finished, it is accomplished. The redemption of mankind has now been complete. And it happens on the day that mankind was actually created, when Adam and Eve was created on Friday, on that sixth day. But not only that, after making that proclamation, it is finished, he is buried, goes into the grave, and what does he do on the Sabbath? Does Jesus die and then immediately go to work somewhere? No, of course not. When you die, you're not working. He's placed into the tomb, and he rests on the Sabbath. Just as God rested on the seventh day from his work of creation, Christ rests from his work of redemption on the seventh day. And so there's some parallels there. And we find that this points to the rest that he provides for us. As Romans chapter 3 and verse 27 talks about, when Jesus went into rest in his death, he was inviting us into that same rest by finding rest from the works of the law. In Romans chapter 3 and verse 27, it says, where then is boasting? It is excluded. By what kind of law? Of works? No, but by a law of faith. For we maintain that a man is justified by faith apart from the works of the law. For thousands of years, people have been laboring under the law of Moses, some 600 and some odd commandments that oftentimes were very laborious. They not only had that, but they also had, the fence laws that the Pharisees and Sadducees had placed on them. They were heavily burdened when Christ came onto the scene. But he came and brought us into a state of righteousness that wasn't dependent upon that laborious law, but upon belief, on faith. In Ephesians chapter 2, in verse 8, it says, for by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not as a result of works, so that no one may boast. Very similar to what we read in Romans chapter 3. And so, we find that through the whole Bible. Start at the front cover and work your way all the way to the back cover. Time and time again, God is leading his people to rest. Our God is a God of rest. Not just because he himself rested, but because he wants his people to rest. And he's always leading us into a state of rest. Well, how is it that faith, slipped that out too quickly. How is it that we come to rest? It's through faith, right? It's through faith. So faith is the key to this rest that God has opened up to his people. We could go rewind the tape, go all the way back again. We could look at each of these stories and we find that these people who experienced rest through God inviting them into rest did so by what? By faith. It was by faith they received rest. As long as Adam and Eve were trusting in the Lord, they could experience rest. They could have been in the garden for thousands of years, perhaps, had they just kept trusting in the Lord, placing their faith in the Lord. When did the rest stop? The rest stopped when they began to seek things for themselves. And they said, oh, we want to have the knowledge of the good and evil. And then we could go with Noah as well. Noah acted by faith, and he and his family were led into rest. We could see the Israelites, they had to step out in faith as they walked through the Red Sea as it parted before them. We could see them also entering into the land of rest, the promised land at the end, through faith. That second generation did so. And we see, of course, through our own spiritual experience that we have found rest through faith in Jesus Christ. So you not only see a theme of rest throughout all of Scriptures, but you also see faith interwoven with rest as you go along. But those are some positive examples. Let's think of some negative examples. Because it's also interesting to see that in Scriptures, you find that not only do you see people actually stepping out in faith and finding rest, but you also find people who did not step out in faith and then end up in works. We could go back to Adam and Eve, right? As we just mentioned before. When they ceased trusting in the Lord, when they ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they were led into a state of toil and labor. In Genesis chapter 3, we have this curse placed on the man. In verse 17, cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. Once they stepped out of the realm of faith, and once they began trying to seize things for themselves, once they started trying to play God and trust in themselves and not trust in the Lord, it led to the curse of what? Of toil, of difficulty, of work, of hardship. It's found there in the curse. Cain and Abel, the first sin outside of the garden that we have recorded for us, was all about this. Cain, instead of trusting in the Lord, instead of seeing what a good sacrifice his brother was giving, and then by faith offering up a more noble sacrifice like his brother Abel, instead became envious of his brother, hated his brother, and actually killed his brother. And that led to more work for him as well. In Genesis chapter 4, God curses Cain, and it causes more work for him. He says in verse 10 of Genesis 4, he said, that is, the Lord said, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. Now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you cultivate the ground, it will no longer yield its strength to you. You will be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth." So Cain was used to working the fields. His brother Abel was one who worked the flocks. He was the one that worked the ground. He knew agriculture. He knew how to plant things and cause them to grow. Well, now all that was going to come to an end. And now he was going to have to be a wanderer. Maybe now he was going to have to pick up what his brother did and have livestock, which requires you to travel great distances to find food for your animals. But nonetheless, he was going to have to wander around, no longer being able to stay at home and rest at home and have a nice garden and things like that. Now he had to go out and work. So we see a man who did not act by faith, and as a result, caused more work for himself. The Israelites themselves, the first generation now we're talking about, came to the brink of the promised land, the land of rest that God had promised them. And they sent out the spies. You remember that story? They sent out the 12 spies. 10 of those spies said, no, there's no way we can enter into this land. There's giants in the land. We were like grasshoppers before them. And they said they have these fortified cities. So yeah, it is a land flowing with milk and honey. It has a lot of fruit, but we can't overtake it. There's no way we could overtake these powerful nations. So they weren't able to enter because of because of a lack of faith. In Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 17, it says, and with whom was he angry? Talking about the Lord. With whom was the Lord angry for 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness? That first generation, the whole generation, except for Joshua and Caleb, died in the wilderness. And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest? But to those who were disobedient. And then 19 sums it up. So we see that they were not able to enter because of unbelief. So there we see a tie of being blocked from the rest that God has for a person, and here for a whole generation of people, because of a lack of faith. So again and again we see a tie between rest and faith. God is a God of rest, and he invites us into rest, but the only way we access that rest is through faith. When they were in the wilderness wanderings, when the people were out there, even before Sinai, when God was providing them with the manna, they began to learn about this whole Sabbath rest. When they collected the manna, they could collect it for 6 days. On the 6th day, they would actually collect a double amount to cover them for the Sabbath. But even then, they were taught to rest on the Sabbath. Don't work on the Sabbath. And then Mount Sinai, this was really solidified in the 10 Commandments. You should keep the Sabbath and keep it holy. It's also in Exodus 20, and then also in Deuteronomy chapter 5, it's reemphasized. But the Sabbath was a big deal for the Jewish community. And there, what was God teaching them? Well, for one, he was wanting them to rest because it's good for us to rest, as we mentioned earlier. But was he not also teaching them faith? Trust me. Rest always requires faith. When, say you're a Jewish person, and you have servants, you have donkeys, you have animals working for you, isn't it more productive to have everybody working 7 days a week? You would think, anyways. You think, if only I had that one more day a week, how much more we could collect, how much more we could harvest if we just could work that last day of the week. There was even weeks in which they were to rest with the different feasts and things like that. On the 7th year, the whole land was supposed to rest. They weren't even supposed to work their land for an entire year on the 7th year. Absolutely and completely having to trust in the Lord to give them enough food those previous years to get them through that 7th year. And then even the year after that, whenever they're rebuilding their crops. And so God was teaching them, yes, to rest, but he was also teaching them to have faith and to trust in him and not trust in their own works and their own labors in that regard. So the Sabbath day required faith. Resting with God requires faith. Now the good news is that we can enjoy rest even today through faith. This isn't something, we'll talk about in a minute, the rest that waits for us in the future. But we'll hold off on that for a moment. And I'd like to encourage us all by just saying, today you can find rest from all your labors. You can rest even today in the same way that people time and time again in the scriptures found rest. Isaiah 40 is perhaps one of the go-to chapters when it comes to this. But here, I like this particular passage, and we're going to be reading 27 through 31 here in a moment, for those who are turning to it. The interesting thing about these passages of scriptures is the mixture of rest and working at the same time. And it's built on faith. He says, "Why do you say, O Jacob, and assert, O Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, and the justice due me escapes the notice of my God?" So this was a text that was written probably to the exiles who had already been exiled into Babylonian captivity. You can imagine the distress that they had. How could God allow this to happen? Why are we so far from the homeland? All these things. And they might have been saying, and I'm sure they were saying these things, my way is hidden from the Lord. God's not helping us out. He's not giving us justice against our enemies. He says in verse 28, do you not know? Have you not heard? The everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, the creator we've been reading about in Genesis 1, does not become weary or tired. Did he rest on the seventh day because he was tired? Probably should clarify that. It's not that God created the world in 6 days and was like, whew, I need to take a break. I need to rest. When it says that God rested on the seventh day, it wasn't because he was tired. Here, resting just means ceasing from labor. Okay? Anytime you stop working, you're resting. It's not necessarily because you're worn out or tired. God doesn't become weary or tired. His understanding is inscrutable. In verse 19, he gives strength to the weary, and to him who lacks might, he increases power. Though youths grow weary and tired, and vigorous young men stumble badly, yet those who wait for the Lord, that is, those who trust in the Lord, those who wait in the Lord, or we could say those who have faith in the Lord, will gain new strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They will run and not get tired. They will walk and not become weary. That's something that's true. It was true for them, for the exiles at that time, but that's true for everybody. And as I mentioned before, notice the mixture here. Does it say that you'll stop running and then you'll rest? And then you'll stop walking and then you'll cease from being weary? No. It says those who trust in the Lord will run, but then they won't get tired. They will walk and not become weary. And so this is a different type of rest than perhaps we're thinking of often. It goes beyond just ceasing from doing things. This is a rest that is a rest of the mind, a rest of the soul, a rest of the spirit. Right? As we trust in the Lord, as we exercise faith, we can have rest in the Lord even today. Which means that whatever your to-do list is this upcoming week, whether you have school, whether you have work, whether you just have things around the house you got to take care of, whether you got family members to attend to, whatever you have to do this upcoming week, did you know that as hard as you're working, as long as your to-do list is, you can all the time be resting? In your heart of hearts, in your mind, in your spirit, you can be maybe sweating physically, laboring hard physically, but all the time be resting internally. If you exercise faith and trust in God. When do we become exercised in spirit? When is it that we become tired and weary and we just get burned out? Oftentimes it's because we're doing things in our own strength. But as we just let go and let God, as they say, as we trust in the Lord, as we say, God, this week belongs to you. This to-do list belongs to you, Lord. I can't do anything in my strength in the first place. So I'm not going to try to do it in my strength, but I'm just going to rest in you. And rest in the fact that you uphold me and that you strengthen me. That you do what you say in Isaiah 40. That I can run, but I won't grow weary. I can I run and not get tired. And I can walk and not become weary because my trust is absolutely in you. We've seen it with Jesus Christ spiritually. As we trust in him and rest in him, we experience that immediately. But at the same time, we can see that experimentally and practically in the day-to-day as we put our trust and hope in God. And then we come to the seventh day of our lives. Did you realize that one day you're going to come to the seventh day of your life? What do we mean by that? There's going to be a day that comes when the work week is over. When our labors on this earth are through. Just as God finished his work on the sixth day and his labors were done, on the day that we leave this life, the day that we leave this world, that will be our seventh day. Your 6 days may look different than my 6 days. All of our 6 days may look different. But one thing that is the same in all of them is this life is full of toil and labor and hardship. Whether you're speaking physically, mentally, spiritually, whatever you want to say, we're just constantly laboring in this world. Constantly trying to earn a living. Constantly trying to tend to the spiritual disciplines. Constantly trying to fight against temptation and against trials that come against us. We're constantly fighting the battle of faith. But one day is going to come when it's going to be the seventh day. We're going to be able to say, All the work is accomplished. Behold, I've run the race. I've kept the faith. Therefore, there awaits me a crown of righteousness that awaits me, as the Apostle Paul was able to say at the end of his life. And when that seventh day comes, guess what? We're going to be able to enter into a wonderful and blessed rest. And it's going to be wonderful. Have you ever worked really hard one day? Maybe it was working at your job, and you just had a hard day. You're working hard. Maybe mentally you were working hard. Maybe if you're in an office setting, but maybe physically you were working hard. Or maybe you were at home and you had some project you were working on, and you worked on it for 12, 13, 14 hours that day, and you're just exhausted. Or maybe you had to deal with difficult people all day, and you just get home and you're just mentally tired. One of the best things when you experience that is when maybe you take a shower and then you get to sit down in the recliner. It's like all the labor is washed away and you just get to rest. Or maybe you get to lay down your head on the pillow at night. There's no sweeter rest than when you've been laboring hard all day long. It's one of the most sweetest experiences in human life. You just get to sit and rest. I would say that that's what it's going to feel like in death. All this trials and difficulties and temptations and hardships that we face in this world, the harder and harder our lives are, the more and more difficult we're just trying to get through the day-to-day, all the more sweeter it's going to be when we close our eyes and rest. And this will be the experience that we have when that occurs. In Revelation chapter 7, in verse 14, it says, or starting in verse 14, it says, I said to him, my Lord, you know. And he said to me, these are the ones who have come out of the great tribulation, and they have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Sing, as we could say for ourselves. In verse 15, for this reason they are before the throne of God, and they serve him day and night in his temple. Now, this serving him is a pleasant service. This is more like the service that they did, or the work they did in Eden, where it's a pleasant work. You get to dwell in the temple of the Lord, the heavenly temple of God, and just serve him. It's a beautiful state. And he says, and he who sits on the throne will spread his tabernacle over them. And then listen to this. Verse 16, they will hunger no longer, nor thirst any more, nor will the sun beat down on them, nor any heat. For the Lamb in the center of the throne will be their shepherd, and he will guide them to springs of the water of life, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. When we finally lay our labors down, when the 6 days are complete, when we say, Lord, I've given this life of faith to you, and it's all done and it's been accomplished, we're going to get to do what God did at the end of creation. We're going to be able to close our eyes and rest. And I think it's going to be the sweetest feeling we've ever felt before when we pass into the next life. Because it's going to be just this overwhelming feeling of rest. And finally I can relax. Finally I can let go. Finally I can enter into the presence of God. But it doesn't just end there. That's not the only state of rest that we look forward to. We also look for an eternal state of rest in the resurrection. In Revelation chapter 21, here the Apostle John sees the new heavens and the new earth. He says, for the first heaven and the first earth passed away, and there's no longer any sea, in verse 1. But then he says, in verse 3, and I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the tabernacle of God is among men, and he will dwell among them, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be among them. Verse 4, and he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there will no longer be any death. There will no longer be any mourning or crying or pain. The first things have passed away. And then in verse 7 he says, he who overcomes will inherit these things, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. So not only do we look forward to that rest that's going to happen at our death, when we lay down our labors, when our 6 days are done, and we get to slip into glory, we get to slip into rest, into eternal bliss. But also we have the hope of resurrection, that one day we will return back to our bodies, be resurrected, be complete, and be unified with our bodies once again, and just keep on resting through eternity. As the song goes, when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first began. It's just going to be this continual, eternal state of rest and blessedness. And that's what we look forward to as believers. So what this ought to do is encourage us to say, you know what? Bring on the work. Bring on the hardship. Bring on the trials. Bring on the temptations, the difficulties. For one, I have a present day rest in God as I trust in Him. As I not trust in myself, but I lean on the Lord. I wait on the Lord, and I find this inner strength that just lifts me up above my trials and troubles. I have that rest that's here and now. But then also I'm looking ahead to that seventh day. I'm looking ahead to that ultimate Sabbath rest, that eternal sabbatical, you could say, in which I will rest with the Lord forever. So that should encourage us today as well. So we have the Lord presently willing to give us rest. He is a God of rest. But we have a God who's also offering eternal rest because He is a God of rest. You can't get a better deal than that. And so this is what God offers us. So these are our thoughts in connection to Genesis chapter 2 and verses 1 through 3, in connection to this rest of God on the seventh day. And hopefully we will all be able to enter into that rest as we trust in the Lord. So that concludes our study today.